In Conflict, a representação oficial portuguesa na 17ª Exposição Internacional de Arquitetura da Bienal de Veneza, em 2021, integra um ciclo de 9 debates. In Conflict propõe revisitar uma seleção de processos da arquitetura nacional pós-25 de Abril, pautados por um amplo debate público e pelo envolvimento dos poderes políticos, da imprensa e da sociedade civil. Iremos dar início à sessão de debate. Agradecemos aos nossos parceiros oficiais, aos coordenadores dos eventos, aos participantes e a todo o público.
Bom dia. Primeiro peço desculpas pelo meu esquecido português, mas também para nós fazia um bocado sentido fazer uma pequena resistência à ideia naturalizada de portugueses, espanhóis, colombianos a falar inglês na Itália, também no marco curatorial do pavilhão. Somos Pablo e o Antônio, editores de Barlewood, uma editora e projeto de investigação à volta da prática espacial com base na Espanha. Antes de começar com o debate, queríamos agradecer a equipa curatorial do In Conflict, da representação portuguesa na Bienale, o Carlos, Luís, João e Miguel, pela oportunidade e também pelo acompanhamento durante o processo, também pelo espaço de discutir temas e questões que para nós relevantes no marco curatorial que achamos valente e com muito compromisso político. Quando começamos a pensar no debate no contexto da proposta curatorial do pavilhão, para nós fazia muito sentido explorar as exclusões da arquitetura e entender que corpos ficavam fora da prática espacial e convidar a pessoas cujo trabalho apresentara formas comprometidas como o presente e modelos de trabalho para uma produção mais justa, desde a prática, a investigação, desde o trabalho com comunidades até museus. Candela Morado e Isabel Gutiérrez Sánchez são arquitetas e antropólogas que têm trabalhado a volta de infraestruturas cidadãs e dos cuidados em entornos urbanos do sul da Europa e Latinoamérica, após a crise de 2008. Diego Barajas e Camilo García, arquitetos e fundadores do escritório de arquitetura Usos, que desenvolve uma prática para nós muito atenta a agentes não humanos e cientes das suas implicações socioeconómicas. E Mariana Pestana, arquiteta e curadora independente que trabalha à volta da prática espacial, da prática social crítica e a ficção como ferramenta de design. Queremos agradecer também de um modo especial a eles pela sua participação e também a Cátia Faria, que é filósofa e investigadora em ética animal portuguesa, que tinha de nos acompanhar hoje, mas por causa do Covid não pode estar, mas achamos que teria sido um excelente input na conversa.
Hello, I will move to English to continue the presentation and to start the content of this assembly, but I would like also to thank to the organization and to the participants of the debate, their presence here. As organizers, we would like to begin this assembly placing ourselves in a particular positions and trying to explain our interest in being here in the Portugal Pavilion at this event and the possible relationship between the content of this assembly or this debate and the content of the pavilion. To do so, it is important to place the context where we belong, to Spain, as we believe that the recent history of both countries are very similar in their timelines and also in their difference. So this allows us to frame some of the key questions or the key conversations that we will have here later. In that sense, how to expand the notion of democracy from spatial practices and how to design caring assemblies. So I don't know if we can put the presentation. So to begin, we proposed you to travel like almost a century ago to the Peninsula Iberica of the early 1930s. Until that date, the concept of universal democracy and suffrage only reached the male population. In the Spanish case, it would be in the year 1933, when the first electoral process in which women actively participate took place. Practically, at the same time, in Portugal, only women with higher education could exercise that right, the right of the vote. The idea of the democracy and the universal suffrage expanded a border that was so established and assumed by centuries. In Spain, this happened in the government of La Segunda República, a democratically elected political project which was a turning point towards the achievement of certain shift towards social equity. A political project that understood that this expansion of the democracy should not remain exclusively in the theoretical sphere but should be transferred into the entire territory. And for this reason, as this image of the Misiones Pedagógicas shows, itinerant cultural infrastructure and architectural infrastructure were created, made up of technicians, theorists, and artists who materially expanded the basis of a democratic project through the entire national territory, especially in those areas and groups of people that had remained aside from the political and architectural matter. Just 3 years after, a reactionary counter-movement led by the dictator Francisco Franco eliminated any kind of this reality. For its part, architecture responded by ideologically positioning itself in many cases in favor of the coup. The case of the architect Luis Moya is explicit. In 1937, together with an artist and a military, designed the following project, entitled An Architectural Dream for a National Exaltation. And we think that this is important because we are reflecting here about the idea of the national pavilions and so on. In it, they collect the principles of the Franco movement embodied in a non-materialized architecture, an architecture that explicitly shows us 4 historical images engraved in the stone of what the state ideology will mean from that moment on. The expulsion of the Muslims and the Jewish people from the Peninsula Iberica in the 15th century, and the position of a single thought against any kind of diversity, the national Catholicism regime. The colonization of America, a colonial position that represented a turning point in the way of understanding the depredation of the territory, the extraction of resources, as well as the violence to complete ecosystems and to human and non-human ways of life. And finally, the exaltation of the Francoist movement, aligned with the totalitarian project that devastated Europe during much of the 20th century. Once again, these ideas didn't remain exclusively in a pure theoretical field, but in one way or another, architecture was embodying and responding to the premise of the Franco regime. Architects, today considered mastered by the history of Spanish architecture, play a fundamental role in spatializing and materializing Franco's political project. This is the case of for example, of the colonization towns, that were the first incarnation of a political ideal, the submissive, traditional, and hardworking man. Projects that many times were the sustenance of extractive and infrastructural projects that caused deep and violent territorial transformations and forced population displacements. All these echoes didn't dissipate with the arrival of the democracy in the Spanish case, a historical period, La Transición, which, unlike Portugal, didn't imply a clear rupture with the previous regime, but rather a kind of veiled continuity of certain modes of thought and relationship with the otherness. This unsolved ground and this spectral presence are still present today, conditioning our vision and architectural thought. And as far as this assembly is concerned, the ways in which space and territory construction practice are thought and reproduced, it is important to reflect and to talk about and discuss about this. Furthermore, the echoes of these visions, far from being exclusive from our country, from Spain, we think that they are expanding and amplifying in other territories, no? With different focus and intensity. And we can even say that of not only the European territory, but in the whole world.
Yes, returning to our present space and time and taking up the storyline of the Portuguese pavilion, we'd like to start with this first assembly, assuming that democracy have always been and are exclusive for certain voices and bodies. Democracies are, by definition, in conflict. And these political projects are deeply embodied and materialized through architectural, territorial, and infrastructural constructions. Projects loaded with ideology, with political positions that define and build the space. But for that very reason, in this assembly, we want to ask ourselves, how is it possible to imagine new worlds? How is it possible to build new models from spatial practices that expand the notion of democracy and heal or repair open wounds? After this short introduction, a general approach where we want to place ourselves and the context of this debate. We don't want to look at the past, but to generate an assembly focused on an immediate present. The aim of this first assembly is not to obtain universal answers or ultimate solutions to the problems that we will go through. We don't want to build our conversation with the grandiloquence of great theoretical and abstract proposals, but quite the opposite. We're interested in delving into situated and committed knowledge, and knowledge and positions halfway between practices and research, between the speculative realm and a political commitment. For this reason, we want to start with assembly knowing each position, each of your positions, a trigger or glimpse of all the conversation that will take place later. In no particular order, we're going to start with Isabel Gutierrez Sanchez and Candela Morado. As mentioned, Isabel is an architect and anthropologist and holds a master in city design and social science from the London School of Economics. She did her PhD at the Butler School of Architecture on crossings among care, citizenship, commoning, and the space in self-organized initiatives in Athens. She teaches at the Butler School of Planning and is particularly interested in the study and reproduction of counter-narratives and imaginaries through ethnography, political fictions, architectural design, and art projects. Candela Morado is also an architect and anthropologist with a specialization in urban studies and territorial planning. She did her PhD on collective methods of urban life sustenance in Bogotá, Colombia, at the Spanish National Research Council. Her areas of interest stand at the crossroad of critical urbanism, urban anthropology, and feminist studies of science. Whenever you're ready, you can start your position.
Well, we first want to say thank you. Thanks for the organizer to inviting us and for proposing such an interesting debate together with Usos and Mariana. We are glad that the debate around care keeps expanding across fields, as we think is a key for our contemporary architectural practice. Well, the global pandemic has only exposed the cracks of our world sustained by the fiction of a certain self-sufficiency and detachment from nature. The dominant order presents itself as the only possible one: capitalist, rationalist, extractivist, patriarchal, white, or that scandalous thing, as Donna Haraway will say, that is nothing other than their world putting down all other possible worlds. These cracks has become now more apparent than ever, but they have been widening for decades to the point of a permanent crisis. This condition of chronic crisis is marked by the displacements it produces: gentrification, migrations, evacuations, or eviction processes. All of them produce detachment between people and territories, people and other people, people and other beings. The focus of architecture has traditionally been on creating settlements. However, we are now faced with what we can call a paradigm of unsettledness. To be unsettled is a condition of life, a condition of precariousness and vulnerability. Nowadays, who can afford not to move, to change, to be moved or to be displaced? Probably it's just a few who can escape this condition, which of course impacts people in different ways and to different extents. As Judith Butler well stated, vulnerability is not distributed spontaneously or randomly, but rather provoked or sustained by political, economic, or urban planning orders, because the lives that matter are built on inequality basis. So, so we want to place our reflection in these unsettledness paradigms as our contemporary world. We think it's interesting to address it because it opens up an ambivalent arena. On the one hand, it produces existential disorientations, precariousness, vulnerability, otherness, contradictory feelings of belonging, divisions, or conflicts. On the other, at the same time, it produces many knowledge, technologies, cultural forms, modes and platforms of relating and politizations. It opens up a space of possibility for new solidarity practices which can help us to imagine alternative forms of collective life. We cannot think on an imaginary about alternative urban futures without confronting the violent impossibility of that future. So the precarity and the uncertainty of the unsettled condition represent a material and a physical threat, but it may also provide an opportunity to reimagine and reinvent the world. So, given this context, we want to pose the following questions. What practices, tools, and concepts can help us to think in grounding assemblages? From where and with whom should we build this architectural practice to come? To address these questions, we first propose a political and a methodological practice to situate ourselves, our context, and to take a stand, to define our positioning. We propose to build the spatial practice to come from and with the peripheries, by which we refer less to a specific geographical locations than to subaltern collectivities who, throughout processes of a struggle, put in practice forms of life in common. The anthropologist James Holston referred to this instance of resistance as a space of insurgent citizenship, highlighting that it's only in what he calls the ethnographic present where we can find the conditions for social transformations along emancipatory lines. We think that there is already a breeding ground for insurgent practices from which very powerful questions are being posed. We would like to bring here an exemplary case in this regard. It is City Plaza Refugee Accommodation Center in Athens. We think it's a powerful example in many ways. Following your first line of thought for the debate, we think that we want to frame it as a case of care assembly that becomes a complex care assemblage. City Plaza was set up in April 2016 when several groups of activists from the political left and a group of refugees squatted the abandoned hotel in Athens. The group stated as the main intentions of the project to create, on one hand, a space of safety and dignity in which to house refugees in the center of the city, and on the other, to create a center of a struggle against racism, borders, and social exclusions, for the freedom of movement and for the right to stay. In the squat, or the house as residents refer to it, different working groups were set up to meet daily needs and also organize political actions. This way, bringing together local activists, international volunteers, and refugees. We think that the everyday political and spatial practice of City Plaza are relevant for this debate for two main reasons that we are going to briefly point, and then we will expand in the debate. First, because City Plaza emerged and develops within the sphere of social reproduction by attending to the sustenance of everyday life in an embodied manner and as a form of struggle. That's why they are marked by the ethics of care. And secondly, the space that mediates this form of self-government was a collectively inhabited one, specifically shaped through practice of housekeeping and homemaking, which are fundamentally practice of care. Taking this stand and examples like City Plaza's inspiration, we would like to conclude by pointing three proposals which we think might be relevant to spark our imagination and desire towards the spatial practice to come. First, we propose to understand the spatial production as a political and a social practice that first and foremost attends to life and its sustenance. For this endeavor, we need a critical and a situate perspective that can challenge existing social and spatial orders, as well as a sensitivity that can attend to the daily assemblages of care amidst precarity. We actually don't think we need to invent a new spatial practices. We believe that other architectures, or architectures otherwise, are already existing, but we require, of course, to bring them to the front, remove them from the disciplinary shadow to which we have condemned them. Secondly, we propose to revisit the concept and meaning of infrastructure as the material practice that makes possible to maintain, continue, and repair our world. That includes our body, ourself, and our environment. We suggest to give architecture an infrastructural character, namely to understand it in a more encompassing, open, and continuously in the making and more than human way. Finally, we propose to think and design with care, to question the ethics of our statement and projects. What is to design an architectural project with care? How and with whom are we going to think and design? What concepts are we going to use? How to take care of an architectural process beyond the opening day? Well, I'm going to leave it here for the moment, and we can discuss all of us together in a bit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Candela. The second position will be conducted by Diego and Camilo. Diego and Camilo are the founders of Usos Architects. Usos is an office that operates in the fields of architecture, urban planning, and micro-landscaping, understood as practices of social transformation. They investigate how these areas mediate the relationships that constitute our day-to-day with non-human nature and between species, involving gender, labor, and colonial dynamics. It does so through research and design, theory and practice. It was founded in Madrid by Diego Barajas and Camilo Garcia, and from this city, it operates regularly between Spain and Colombia. So whenever you want.
Okay. Hello. Well, thank you. It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Butler, to Antonio, Pablo, in Conflict, DEPA, for having these debates. We would like to share 5 ideas. I don't know, Diego, 5 ideas which are part of the research that we have carried out at Usos for almost 20 years now, through projects of architecture, gardening, and micro-urbanism, through exploring what we call interwoven architectures. These projects aimed to test certain overlaps between multi-species, non-heterocentric, and anti-racist perspectives. The first one, interwoven architectures. In this one, we start from the premise that in order to seek alternatives to the dynamics of oppression and violence that spatial practices usually entail, we need to tend to the different relationships that shapes us as a society, as well as the structural power dynamics which are linked to these relationships. We understand this not separately, but together, including the structural dynamics that shapes us as spatial practitioners. The second, rethinking exclusions in spatial practice. From our point of view, we must start from rethinking the structural exclusions of species, gender, race, and class, which take place in spatial practice. This process consists of collectively rethinking with whom we think about and make architecture, and ultimately, who are the doers and makers in this discipline, and who are the ones who are making theories about it, theorizing or producing knowledge. We start from the premise that diverse architecture cannot exist without diverse bodies that think about it and make it. We think that in this process of rethinking ourselves, even within critical urbanism activisms, there are urgent pending tasks that have to do with structural forms of power. For example, breaking up with Eurocentrisms or white hegemony, understood here not as a skin color, but as a political regime. We also think that it's not possible to think of a collective us beyond human nature if we're not capable of restituting negated humanities, as the Black historian and intellectual Giovanna Xavier would say. We believe in the urgency of gathering a common subject that is broad and diverse, and that is not just present as an object of study, something to be studied, but which operates also among a subject that is a maker. So those who make decisions or produce knowledge or execute it, as well as in the conceptual frameworks that we use to describe the realities that we work with. And the third, interweaving places of speech with our own spatial practice. When trying to grapple with the labor of diversifying the doer and thinking subject, the doer and thinking subject in the field of spatial practice, there is a key area of inquiry which has been important to us both in the personal and the professional realm. We're talking about the acknowledgement of what various Afro-Caribbean and Latino feminists, such as Brazilian philosopher Jamila Ribeiro, have called the place of speech, as she called it in Portuguese, lugar da fala. So we are interested in rethinking different ways of understanding both our gaze and the architecture we make, not as separate entities, but as interwoven things. Defining the idea of the doer as an abstract, exclusively rational subject, feminist thought has shown us the personal, economic, social, and geopolitical realities that go through us on a daily basis permeate our gaze or our approach to work, conditioning our actions. The viewpoint, so the viewpoint can be applied to our practice as architects. In our case, these realities have conditioned a series of frequently diverging experiences. This divergence is linked, for example, to the fact that we are read as whitino, which means basically white males from Latin America, white Latin Americans, and have had privileged access to education, and at the same time we inhabit non-heteronormative bodies. And because of our accents when we speak Spanish, we are read as Northern Andean migrants in Spain. Therefore, we tend to be racialized or doubly othered on a daily basis. In our case, the sum of these factors have shaped a series of very different or even radically opposing experiences depending on the context and who we are speaking to. So these experiences have taught us that we all inhabit relationships of privilege and subordination that are always relative, as they're constructing in multiple relational spheres. These learnings have shaped our minds and have made way into our design process. For instance, during the design process of the Sinantrolopshak teleworking abode, there were at least two overlapping relational spheres which we wanted to explore with particular attention. On the one hand, there were the micro-realities of a migrant non-heteronormative home, which we are part of, and particularly Diego and Juan, his boyfriend, in a context in which traditional homes appear to be hegemonic, at least on the surface, and where architecture seems to respond solely to a single kind of family unit, a kind of a white, heterosexual, Western subject. This is in urbanized pine forest in the mountains in Madrid. On the other hand, beyond the asymmetrical power relationships that emerge between this home and other subjects of the same species that surround it, we deemed it necessary to acknowledge our power positions as dwellers, as architects, against other species in this urbanized forest, but also in relationship to nature in general, as members of an undoubtedly domineering species on a planetary scale, at least in relation to other animal species. In this case, issues regarding gender and species were not tackled separately, but together. Fourth, the acknowledgement of our privilege and other oppressions as building materials of affective spaces. Something we find particularly revealing in terms of acknowledging the relational gear that is activated from our place of speech is being accountable for our privileges. In our case, there are not a few. Our privileges relate to species, class, skin color, and sex. Although we are Latino migrants in Spain, our light skin color means that we will probably never be object of police violence in the way that darker bodies experience it in Madrid, in Spain. Or although we're not straight, we know how to perform, or at least we think we know how to perform, and such as one when it's necessary, for example, in contexts such as a building site. So we are aware that in certain situations we have a tremendous performative privilege in comparison to other bodies, sometimes even in comparison to bodies which are close to the top of the privilege chain, so to speak. So we think it's relevant to work on our privileges because it prevents us from navel gazing. Instead, it invites us to look into different subalternized subjectivities and types of violence that are exerted upon other bodies, which we may benefit indirectly, whether we are aware of it or not. In this revision process, we have been accompanied by various currents of thought. For example, the colonial and anti-racist thought, Southern feminisms, anti-speciesism, and heterodox Marxisms. For example, anti-speciesist thought was key for challenging our species privilege in many of the gardening works that we carried out in the Sinantro Love Shack in Madrid. In this case, it was particularly revealing to understand anti-speciesism in relation to anti-racist position or to queer thought. This allowed us to broadly rethink the concept of plague, plaga, which has been used so many times, not only against non-human animals, but also against human groups, for instance, migrants or queer people. Can interweaving architectural work with our places of speech help us to build new imaginaries, but also new affective spaces? Can it help us to imagine an architecture of a broader, more diverse us? And the fifth, located laboratories interwoven with one another. Our place of speech, it is in its specificity reveals its partiality. Then we think of projects as incomplete explorations that can only be understood next to a world populated by other explorations, laboratories located next to other localized laboratories. So I think we can stop here and leave other ideas for the debate.
Thanks, Diego and Camilo, for the wonderful presentation. Last but not least, we'll finish this the introductory round with Mariana Pestana. As mentioned, she is an architect and independent curator interested in critical social practice and the role of fiction in design for an age marked by technological progress and an ecological crisis. She's a member of the collective The Decorators and recently co-curated the exhibitions The Future Starts Here at the Victoria and Albert, Eco-Visionaries, Art and Architecture After the Anthropocene at the MAT, Matadero and Royal Academy. And she has recently curated the 5th Istanbul Design Biennale, Empathy Revisited, Designs for More Than One. Whenever you are ready.
Thank you. Gracias. Thank you for inviting me. It's really a pleasure. It's an honor to be here and also in such great company. I thought today I would present one key idea, which is, hopefully my slide will work. Oh, that's still Huzus. Oh, okay. I mean, I'm a fan, but yeah. Okay, great. Thanks. So one idea, which is this idea of empathy as decentering. And I will briefly explain what I mean by this and where I position myself in relation, why I use these terms, why I'm fascinated about them. And then I will go through a few examples, very few examples of projects, two that were developed in the context of the Istanbul Design Biennial, which I curated, as was mentioned, and which is really what I was asked also to bring here today. And then one project that I developed in the context of the decorators, which is a practice that I co-run together with Xavi Arcfont, who is here actually, and Suzanne O'Connell, and also Carolina Caicedo. But let me begin by speaking on empathy and why I find these terms so fascinating. When we think of empathy, it's a word that circulates a lot, and especially since the 1950s. When we see this word, we tend to think of it as a way to understand or to simulate or to grasp other people's feelings. This is what we tend to associate with empathy. But the term empathy, when it became used more broadly about 100 years ago, when it was, let's say, invented, at least in its English form, it was used to describe how feelings transferred onto objects and the natural world as well. So not people, really. And there was a writer, a British writer, Violet Paget, was one of the people to write about empathy. She wrote under the male pseudonym Vernon Lee, and she described it as the lending of one's life to a thing, which I find really a beautiful image and very productive image. I learned about this history of empathy and this term through a historian of psychology and psychiatry and neuroscience, Susan Lanzoni, who shows through her work, she spent the last 10 years studying this term, and she shows that empathy often requires, and I will quote her, a shift in the shape of the self, so as to enter into alien forms, to transform into objects, and to inhabit other realities. So to empathize is, by definition, to feel into something else. So it's an act of disembodiment, of decentering. And it's not about humanizing the other, you know, when we're talking about the natural world or a geologic body or an animal or a plant. It's not about humanizing that other, but it's really about othering the human. So in doing that, in forcing us to other ourselves, it destabilizes this boundary between one and other, or these two entities. And so what I'm interested in is in this empathy's invitation to escape one's body and one's position. And you might say, you know, from a very skeptical position perhaps, that this is a pointless exercise because we can never escape our body, our situatedness, our anthropocentrism, and I mean, in relation to many of the things you've talked about, you know, it's very difficult to escape one's position. And yes, it is, of course, a physical and an ontological impossibility in many ways, but I really trust that in the effort of escaping the center, of detaching from one's body and doing this effort of seeing from another perspective, that we may see the world differently. Like empathy, narrative fiction always begins with this decentering gesture. So we dislocate the center of the real world into a new imagined one, and from that new center, other possibilities are imagined and they are conceived of, often for the first time. So alternative worlds are built and a pact is formed between an author and a reader, for example, which is an agreement to suspend disbelief and behave as if that world really existed. And so what happens in this process of dislocation or decentering, I think if the story is good, it will really make us reassess the world that we live in when we come back to it. So for example, freedom seems less stable after reading Margaret Atwood, or religion looks very different after reading Voltaire, or voting feels much more urgent after reading José Saramago, in our case in Portugal. Possessions aren't as valuable after Ursula Le Guin. So I think empathy is an effort of decentering, of stretching worldviews, seeing the world from other perspectives, and this practice of distorting. It's this effort of distorting, defocusing, warping, elasticating reality. I believe that it's particularly interesting to think of empathy, and perhaps that's why I was also fascinated by it in this moment in time, because the interdependence, the coexistence of humans within larger ecosystems has been subject to many disciplinary, interdisciplinary discourses in the last decade with a great, great emphasis. And so I think aligned with those discourses and all of the intersectional questions and debates that come with it, as the previous panelists so well outlined, I think, I think design can work as this invitation to consider the empathic possibility of interfaces of materials and so on. So an invitation, I'm interested in this invitation of design as a mediator of emotions between people, but also between people and other entities, biological, geological, mineral, machinic bodies such as plants or objects, and etc. So let me just mention a few examples. As a curator of the 5th Istanbul Design Biennial, in which I also collaborated with Sumitra Upham and Billy Muraban as part of my team, we did an axis, a programmatic axis, which was called New Civic Rituals. It was a series of projects installed outdoors in the city of Istanbul, where the biennial was happening, which called for a redefinition or a broadening of the notion of citizenship. So here, for example, you're looking at Studio Osidiana's Buyukada songlines, which is a floating island designed with an interspecies agenda, we could say. So it caters for the pleasure of humans, but also for that of plants and birds in this case. So it requires an attuning to the vast scale of migration patterns, for example, of birds and their associated ecosystems that come with that. But more than anything, this was a floating island that was really traveling between the archipelago of the Buyukada Islands. And so as it was traveling, it was also hosting a series of conversations about the contested nature of some of those sites that has to do, for example, with transplantation of coral, with the permanence of horse carriages in the islands, with the reduction of fish in the fishing stocks in the area. So in this case, this architecture has this purpose of acting both as an object and a narrative device to start conversations. Also, as part of this series, Eli, who are a group of architects from Madrid, and Orkan Telen, who is a Turkish artist, developed Microbial Fruits of Istanbul. So this is, the architectural element here is this kiosk. And on the right, you see one of the things that were created, the product that was given to people inside of this kiosk. So let's say, so what they did is they collected soil from a great number of bostans, which are these 1,000-year-old agricultural gardens in Istanbul, which are incredibly contested spaces, once again, to do with at risk of disappearing because of gentrification processes and large developments in the city of Istanbul, but which are incredible historical examples of production of architecture in the city, but also the economical model in which they were ran. And so they collected soil from all of these gardens, and then sequenced the DNA of the microorganisms that they found in these soils. And from those microorganisms, they then created what they call a new oral culture. So they developed a series of popsicles, which they distributed as a fermentation kit, so that the lives of these microbes from all the soils in Istanbul can continue to live in people's guts. So in a sense, sort of rewilding, through that process of, let's say, gut rewilding, the idea is also that the visitor or the citizen becomes a carrier of this culture that is thousands and thousands of years old. And then finally, this is a project that we are developing at the moment at the Decorators. It's a series, it's a project called Portal Tables, and it reflects on the paradoxical way in which the pandemic has both vilified microbial life and prompted a renewed interest in homemade practices of nurturing microbial life through fermentation. So a lot of people turned to the making of bread and cheese at home and other foods. And so what we are doing with this project, and Xavi is here, he can also help me out if I need to, and perhaps then in the discussion participate, but it's taking this idea of commensality, which is eating together, and extending it beyond the human. So to think about how microbial bodies may participate in these processes of commensality. We started in Kingston upon Thames, and perhaps we can talk about this more, which is a neighborhood in the city of London where fermentation has a particular take in history. But what we wanted to do here were a series of furniture pieces that can live in the house. So this one is for making bread, for airing bread. And they are washable and inflatable, as you can see. And there are two more pieces. One is for making cheese, and one is for making kimchi collectively. And the idea is that they're fun, and they're a little bit humorous perhaps, but they are conveyors of these affective relationship across people and also other bodies. And I think I'll leave it here and we can continue. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for all the presentation. I think that we're really interesting to know your positions and your urgencies and all the things and all the topics that you are putting in the table in this kind of assembly. I think it is even clearer why there are a series of systematic and systemic exclusions taking place. This kind of different from the urban to the microbial spatial practices, no, that we have seen here at different scales, different territories. A number of bodies, a number of agents are being excluded from these discussions that affect them directly in so many ways. No, so to start the conversation, to start this discussion, I would like to ask you, just as an entry point to the discussion, no, to put more things on the table and to start to talking together and discussing also with the audience. Maybe it's a naive question, but maybe it's just a good entry point, no? That what are those voices or those kind of bodies that, in your opinion and from your perspective and from your areas of interest that are so different, no? And I think that it was one of our interests as organizers of this assembly to bring different approaches to spatial practices. What kind of voices or what kind of bodies do you think that are more urgent to incorporate into this discussion? Just as an entry point.
So I think this is a very important question that actually we need to ask ourselves, I would say, over and over. As you say, Pablo, at the beginning, we're not looking here for universal answers. And I think this question of who is included, who is excluded, every time we undertake a new project, the way we frame our statements and everything needs to be posed and revalued. I think that's as a starting point. Maybe following Haraway, this idea of like, staying with the trouble, right? So like constantly revisiting it and posing it. Given said that, I think Candela, we would like to propose to that is the peripheries, the bodies, the voices of the peripheries, meaning, as we've said, like those collectives who come together to struggle over issues of social reproduction, including like access to healthcare, for instance, or access to education, access to like proper housing, to the land, to water, electricity. So it's covered like many issues concerning life, the life sustenance, no? And how these groups, by coming together and like pushing this struggle, create alternative forms of life in common, or like organizing things different to that of capital in a way. So I think those people, those collectives, they develop like also together with their political practice, it entails also like a very intense spatial practice as well. So I think maybe more than including them in our conversations, we would suggest that we as practitioners go look at their practices and maybe get involved as well. I think that would be a good way of starting actually to think of this new spatial practice that we want to start running soon. That would be, I think, our approach.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that perhaps the way it would respond, you know, the urgent voices that I think we need to listen to, and those that perhaps provide us with alternative, I suppose, models for how we can continue to live. For example, in the context of the climate crisis, it's really interesting to understand that, you know, for example, the places that have been keeping higher levels of biodiversity are places in which there are small, much cohesive communities. These are communities that are not of a very big, large scale. So often these things are intertwined. And so by looking at sort of smaller communities that have developed a very close sort of connection with place, I think often we also find interesting models of coexistence, which I think we can learn from. I think that in terms of how architecture as a practice carries that responsibility, I mean, it's really a huge question. I find it's a bit daunting as well, like to, you know, the idea that that through practice an architect can or should or has the place to pass on the voice to someone else. It's extremely, I think, difficult. It's something that I think we've struggled with a lot in our practice, the decorators, in this role of mediating. I think that in terms of how these projects may articulate some of those ideas, the ones that I talked about, I think, for example, Elie and Orkan Telen, they talk of themselves as, you know, the role of the designer as a diplomat, in a sense, you know, and they are drawing from Viveiros de Castro, and they do this, of course, but this idea of diplomacy I find quite interesting, right, which is, it's also not a disinterested entity, you know, it's not completely neutral or disinterested, so there's something always at stake when doing this, yeah, this jump. But then maybe in relation to some of the projects we saw here as well, I would say that often these architectural projects that exist within cultural frameworks, they also are extremely complex, right? So when they sort of mediate, they sort of mediate so many realities, and I think it's important to embrace this complexity and not deny it. But also, I think the challenge is how to then, for the project, how can the project then exist and be understood and be lived in a way that is not alienating as well. So how to distill the discourses and the complexity of the approaches that architecture takes, you know, in its positioning, to then the actual, you know, the experience of the real and tangible and haptic, you know, experience that will be lived. Yep.
Yeah, I think it's very important question, and I think when maybe one key issue is that when we think about excluded bodies, it's quite important to acknowledge that they are, on the other side, privileged bodies as well. And privileged is very much traversed, is very much crossed by the oppression of others, whether we are conscious or not of it. So I think it's also important to dive and to, you know, have, for us, at least this is quite important to have an inquiry into different forms of power and how power and domination is structured. And although privilege and power and domination is very diverse and is very complex, it is crossed also by structural forms of power, no? Like related with gender, related with race, related with class, related with species, and others. So how to deal with also with our own privileges for us is quite an issue, and how to deal with that in our design process is quite important, because we are not living in a symmetrical world, but how to deal with this asymmetrical condition. And especially when the ones who speak are mostly in architecture and in many other fields, part of the privileged. And I think also when we look at domination, it's quite important to realize that immediately when there is domination, there is immediately, almost always I would say, or is to see that there is a resistance, and resistance is so important to realize, no? That, so there are always counter forces, no? Like the Hotel Plaza you were mentioning before, for example, no? In Athens. And I think to realize about these resistances is very important, because also it prevents us to fall in what we could call the savior syndrome, no? And I think white people, those, no, of us, like whites and men and white men, we're especially eager not to fall into this kind of savior syndrome, no? And to save. So I think it's more about to understand the counter forces that are already there, and to join them, and to try to just, you know, like, to work with what is existing already there. For example, our projects are very limited. I mean, it's just, you know, like, but very small, and the kind of actions that we can do are very limited. But still, for example, in the Sinantro Love Shack, to work with the knowledge of people, of the neighbors, for example, and about these counter forces of how to understand the plague, or how to understand the caring of the forest, was very important to get to know how to somehow join those forces and work with these people, for example, and just to be one more voice, working, for example, with some process of caring of non-human animals, for example, in this body, in this anthropocized forest, or trying to find the associations and realize this was just a process of discovering the people who was already creating some kind of very strong counter proposals of the way forest, Mediterranean forest, for example, in this case, are managed against biodiversity, against many species, and at the end also against human beings, even if we are not completely aware of that.
Thanks, and I think I'll keep this idea of this double condition of you are proposing, no? The way we can understand the architectural project and its violences and its power structures, but also the way we can engage with other processes that are taking place in cities and territories, and be kind of an active, a technical activist in that sense. The architecture can operate in that way. Also trying to connect with some of the approaches of the pavilion, we wanted to propose also a metaphor about democracy. If we visit classical Greece, the supposed cradle of democracy, the access to the world, to logos, according to modern accounts, was only restricted to very small spectrum of the population, men in a very privileged economic position. Only those who had logos and recognized an authorized voice had the ability to access and decide on public space. In opposition to this voice, the logos, privilege, and in dialogue with power, we can find the phone, an intimate and diverse voice used by all those agents excluded from the democratic spectrum. Taking a leap to the immediate present, we would like to ask you if it is possible to collect this embodied phone in countless situations and problems to make it reach the public sphere. In your positions, you have approached design realities while traveling through architectural practices, self-initiated initiatives, and collaborative projects within the framework of communities. We would like to know how it is possible to collect this voice of these agents without imposing tyranny of the forms of street language from power or from design, or in other words, how to be able to listen and bring to the assemblies these phones of agents whose voice is not being heard, or due to their non-human condition do not even have an understandable voice. Which are these mechanisms unveiled by your practices or research processes that you are investigating?
I think that's another very relevant question. How to include this finesse again as part of the conversation. I would say that through our research practices with communities who put in practice different sorts of participatory and democratic mechanisms to reach decisions, to agree on codes and rules, we've come to the realization that the assembly, which is normally quite celebrated as the key or the fundamental mechanism of decision-making, as the key democratic practice, it's never sufficient because it's based, as we saw, on a speech, on language. And despite the many efforts of translation, there is always bodies, there is always voices that are going to be left out. That's like one of our conclusions, which just doesn't mean that this is an important tool for us to come together and decide how we want to live in common, how we want to organize ourselves. I would like to bring to the table two examples, one referring to City Plaza, that tells or that to back this point. For instance, in City Plaza, there were at least two types of different assemblies. One was organized to deal with issues like more broader political issues, how they organize, who or like which groups they would join in the streets, which types of campaigns they would take part in. And the other assembly was more related to the issues of the house, how we organize, how do we do the housekeeping and everything. So the character of the assemblies was like formal, again, like everyone has the right for their voices to be heard. And eventually some rules, some codes were agreed after all these processes, which tended to last for many hours. But then there were like the working groups in the squad. The working groups, and each of them would take care of like an area of the house, be it like the kitchen or children or like cleaning the stairs or the clinic. And on a day-to-day basis, actually they would make, remake, reorganize, invent new rules, those that were previously agreed on the assemblies. So actually, in practice, they were like the main like agents in the squad. Like this sustaining of the everyday life in the squad was actually made possible by those working group, whose logic I think is very different to that of the assembly, which is like, again, it's like a parliament. It's more of like, it belongs more in the representational sphere, where the working groups worked more on an informal basis, based on the contingency of the situation, on the resources available, on affections too, on like tacit agreements on the relationships, which again, of course, creates like many misunderstandings and conflicts. But practically, they were the ones like keeping the space running. So I'm not saying that the assembly wasn't important at all, but it's just a point of like demystify it as the only or the sole mechanisms to come together and to be able to reach, to make decisions. I'm thinking also of the 15M movement, of the movement of the squares in 2011, where again, the assembly was a very important element of the squares, right? But we think that if it weren't for all the infrastructure, the actually reproductive infrastructure that was created, like with a library, with an infirmary, with a space for cooking, spaces for rest, that sustained that this like infrastructure of sustenance of this like emerging city within the city, it wasn't impossible like for the assemblies to take place. So I think we want to claim here is that like all these infrastructures of care, of support, are also practices enabling the democratic practice of coming together, of deciding, of taking decisions. So they can be complementary, I think, if that makes any sense.
Okay, I think it's very important question, very relevant to think how to collect the voices of those agents without tyranny, no, as you said, and how to listen, and how also to deal with this issue of not understandable voices sometimes, no, for example, when we deal with non-humans. And I think that the problem of listening is a key issue, I think, for us and both of us. And I think it's a field of inquiry from where we listen and what is the relation between our gaze and the architecture we do, not as separate but interwoven together, and how we can reconstruct this relation between those two. And in that sense, this idea of lugar de fala, of place of speech, is quite powerful in being to acknowledge somehow these relations and also the many times asymmetrical and privileged positions in which we are in relation with the realities we engaged and we work with. And so I think also is quite for us is quite a key issue to deal with these privileges, because it also emphasize or make it so clear the gap, sometimes the enormous gap that there is between us and the realities we are dealing with. So as soon as we see this gap, the only way is to, how to deal with that and to create a plural. I think there is a call from this gap to create a plural as to deal with this gap and to deal with all the kind of challenges that this relation poses. And I think that's why we need to open up and diversify the us in architecture, both outside of our practices, but also inside of our practices. With whom we work, who we read, what are the references, what are the knowledge, where it comes, the knowledge, where it comes from, are all our references white, Western? Can we go and see other knowledge? Do we realize this lack of other knowledges that are so much needed, no? What Bonaventure, so Beijing, the Cameroon-born, Berlin-based curator talks about, no? How we can go and change this relation of thinking of those that we have understood always as the others, as the object of study, as the subject. Can we go from objecthood to subjecthood? I think that's a very key issue in relation to this question.
Thank you. No, I think that's really, this gap is really the paralyzing moment. And I think it's interesting to see that we are at a moment in which, through discourse and this biennial and this whole context, I think is a step in this direction, where the through discourse, we are beginning to have a shared conversation, but it's this difficulty of putting it into practice. And but to answer the question of how, what models we do put into practice, in my, within the very humble examples that I can offer of the kinds of practices I'm involved with, I think for us it's been really a questioning of processes of hospitality on the one sense, and the conflict that comes with engaging in hospitality in the first instance. So the inevitably hierarchical situation that exists in any form of any delineation of guest and host, right? I think Derrida is really helpful in that sense in this context when he talks about the process of hospitality that develops even in the most mundane of situations. When we have a guest at home, we are incredibly welcoming. We are really happy to have someone at our place for a while. But perhaps on day 2 or day 3, it starts to become a little bit uncomfortable, right? We don't know exactly how to move in our own house. We don't know how we used to use the kitchen before that. And so there is a tension that starts to develop between those two entities. And I find that thinking critically about hospitality and what it means to open space for more and to leave the door open for more, I think it's interesting to think about the conflicts that generates as well. And I think we need to be welcoming of those. In my work, in my curatorial work, I have often created these structures of hospitality through kind of media, or let's say distributed agencies through the people that were involved in projects. So in the case of the projects that I've shown you today, with the Istanbul, with New Civic Rituals, what we did was we identified, first of all, we created a group, which was the Young Curators Group, based in Istanbul, which were 3 curators that are based in the city and know the city very well. And they had the responsibility of linking the projects that were being developed in a research phase with specific contexts in the city and hosts in the city. So every project then belonged to a community that cared for it and who also decided on the future of each of these projects. So they took on, let's say, a first life as participating projects of a biennale, let's say. And then through this community of care or these hosts, they then entered a second life. So for example, with Studio Acidiana, those pieces were then transferred onto one of the islands and made into a public space. But there are many examples like this. In the context of our work with the decorators, normally, I think for many years, and especially my colleagues Suzanne O'Connell and Carolina Caicedo developed a really very in-depth methodology of listening, right, through, in our case, radio as a medium, and the development of specific tools of, for example, giving training in radio and interviewing so that we could listen to more than just the immediate communities that we were working with. This was really, really important. I believe that what cultural projects do or can do in the context of contributing for widening these modes of assembly is to create states of exception, so to delineate spaces, and I mean that in a very literal way, like but spaces where you can play with legal frameworks, with power structures, where you can test out certain things that wouldn't necessarily exist without that cultural framework. And I think that's the value of, I think, that's how, one way, I suppose, in which cultural projects can contribute to widening what we mean by assemblies.
I think also especially we as we are architects, but we are not practicing, we're kind of skeptic or pessimistic about the limitations of capitalism and their frameworks. In that sense, I think we live in an increasingly standardized public space, even scarce, privileged, and commercialized private space. We have seen the failure of the left's spatial projects, housing projects, for example. And we would like to ask in a quite practical way, how can we find these gaps or cracks through which to build better alternatives? I think, for example, you mentioned about this case of City Plaza. We wonder how can, from design practices, adapt or get these tools to design practices. I don't know if you practice or you know other practices that in some way have adapt or take these tools in order to design before capitalism absorbs every concept and process. You also mentioned this idea that is very powerful to us, that you use this metaphor of the Trojan horse while designing, this idea of bringing some sensitivities that are not normal in design processes or not apparently part of the architectural discourses into private commissions with normal clients and classic clients. This idea of how can we, if we have limited access to architectural projects, how can we hack in another way the projects, the normal projects we have? You mentioned also the idea of your curatorial practice as a way of mediation between communities, how design can be, how can develop devices for mediation between communities and trying to unveil some sensitivities from the public realm, for example. In that sense, we would like to ask which are the tools you detected as capable of reverting these asymmetries while designing as designers.
So maybe referring again to the example of City Plaza that we've brought here to the table. So the spatial production in the squat, in the hotel, was super intense on an everyday basis. They not only like refurbished the whole hotel to settle in, to move in, but on a daily basis, like everything was transformed. For instance, the lobby was transformed into a barbershop or a hairdresser's. The staircase would become like a play area for the kids. The dining room, for instance, would be transformed to host parties or the assemblies, and so on and so forth. And I think key to this like very intense spatial production was the act of dwelling, understanding dwelling like as a radical practice of as an agency of being able to create, to imagine, to transform a space in order to make it your own. And I think this act of dwelling, at least in examples like us in City Plaza, encompassed practices of housekeeping, practices of homemaking. The residents would decorate like all the walls of the squat, so to have their faces, to make them feel that they were at home. And I think all these practices, ultimately, they are practices of care, which even though they are imbued, we practice care as part of a capitalist system, they are not capitalist practices in the sense they are not instrumental, they are not like seeking profit, right? So I think there is like a lot of like potential there especially in these practices of care when emerging from experiences of a struggle, of people coming together to resist. And I think this allowed, maybe linking back to Mariana, your idea of empathy. I think what all these political spatial praxis on the everyday life of the hotel allowed or yield were like many encounters, meaning like productive encounters between like different subjectivities, different subjects of very different backgrounds with very different stories. So this like living together allowed for like spaces, like for moments of encounters as transformation. So I displace myself, no longer I'm the same, and the other as well. So it's like a mutual displacement to become, and not, after that, the other is no longer the other. I see it maybe as my friend, as a comrade. So this process of like empathic transformation. So I think all this that emerges just from people coming together, that's true in like very exceptional circumstances, but of like not only to meet everyday needs but actually to do it in a way which is resisting, which is like trying to propose really like new ways of life in common. So I think we can learn from examples of City Plaza. We have researched many others, and that is why we want to insist on looking at these collectives, because there we can find many tools, many questions also for our own practice as spatial practitioners, I would say.
It's really interesting to hear you talk, and it's funny because for this project that we are developing, Portal Tables, it was really important to us the thinking of the philosopher Federico Campagna, and in particular there was an essay he wrote already quite some time ago. It was called The First and Future Table, where he questioned, where he called for the primordial or perhaps more spiritual function of the table, and questioned the fact that for anything, any object almost to be allowed to exist in the current framework, it has to link to economic production, right? And so it's almost like nothing legitimately is allowed to exist sort of outside of this capitalist framework. And so he really calls for this redefinition of what the table is, and we took that a little bit as a starting point to begin questioning, you know, what else does a table as the most basic sort of assembly object, let's say, what else can it convey, really? And in that sense, for example, I think Sarah Ahmed was also really important to us in terms of making us consider the ways in which bodies gather equally in many ways around the table, and this idea of the table as a support structure, right? The table as a support structure for those whose bodies may be absent from it. But in you know, in this journey that we went through over the last couple of years, which resulted in a number of pieces, I mean, I'm sorry, I could only show a few, but I think what we realized as well, or at least from my perspective, was also the importance of reclaiming joy, like reclaiming playfulness and the fun and the moment of fun that a lot of people were having when using these pieces. And I think that this is a political project, the project of caring in this sense of also like this emotional responsibility for one another, and the reclaiming of the spaces in which communities develop. We often work with food as a mediator of those relationships, and as part of this investigation we were also looking at how food more chemically or microbially is connected with a mental well-being and sort of the production of certain hormones and the production of joy in that way. But I think in the project itself, the process was joyful as well, in terms of how we were also connecting these ideas, and I really believe that that's quite key, to reclaim joy.
In relation to this, I think for in our work, there's something we think in these imperfect laboratories that Diego was referring to earlier, and also to something that Mariana was referring, or I think you as well, the possibilities of architecture in mediating, not between different agents and between different realities. Architecture can play this role as a mediator. And in this sense, we have used this idea of introducing these Trojan horses to also work with the imaginaries, to that architecture can elicit or evoke or relate to. For example, in the project that we've been discussing today a little bit in the background, we deal with the pine processionary moth, which is a caterpillar that it's called by most of the people, it's considered to be a plague, which is plague. It's something that really doesn't exist in biology because there is no plague as such. It's just something that people who only see nature as something that you can extract things from, and you can make, and it's something that you actually can make money or make profit out of it, and if you don't, then there is a plague. So anything that is not profitable may be or can be considered part of that idea, which is very problematic. So in that sense, what we were doing in this project, and then it comes the idea of the Trojan horses, that we were working with birds, which is not directly working with the pine processionary moth, but it's something that is kind of interesting. Apparently, most of the people like birds because they're perceived as pretty species, but the caterpillar by many people is perceived differently. So basically what we are trying to seek is for alternatives to the fumigation of pine forest in the Mediterranean, which are highly anthropized, and there is a lot of pine processionary moth because of the global warming, and it's going up and upwards in Europe, moving northwards because it's warming up, so there will be more pine processionary moth, but if we keep fumigating it, many species are not present in those ecosystems, and therefore there's more pine processionary moth, and then there's more fumigating. So basically this is just an action that tries to reestablish some of the, by placing cavities that are not existent in anthropized forest because the forest, because of the fear of fire, all trees are removed from the forest, and trees never are let to be grown too old because they can fall. So basically there are no cavities and there are no birds, and then there's more pine processionary moth. So somehow working with those birds, it's a sort of a way to introduce this ecosystemic thinking, ecosystemic understanding by using some species that have this perception. No, we also have done this in another project in a building which attracts butterflies because butterflies have also kind of this appealing. But then basically we were dealing with the fact that there is a competition for resources, and usually the areas that are richer in terms of the natural resources are where most of the biodiversity is located, but is where most of the people is living as well. So how can we reconcile those two realities? No? The fact that endemisms and biodiversity is also located where most of the human activity is. So then we work with these butterflies in a shop, basically trying to introduce the dialogue with this whole other issue by using those species socially perceived as beautiful or positive, but we were interested in the caterpillar, in the other insects which have other perceptions. And then, yeah, we try to also insert this into the survey, no, in the quantity survey. So then it somehow has a place in the project. Yeah. I don't know.
No, I just wanted to add that in this process of assembly, also these other bodies which are not so socially desirable, but as our citizens are also inhabitants of the ecosystems that we are part of, no? Insects, bats, etc. And in relation to what you were talking in the projects, or for example the project with Eli, no, and Orham, no, I think it's very important also how in this dealing with these other bodies, sometimes that they cannot speak, and in filling this gap to work with people that has dedicated their entire life many times to understand, to deal with that. And for us, for example, it's so important, no, to work with biologists, with gardeners, with neighbors in this pine forest in Madrid, to get a lot of knowledge and to create a kind of more stronger and more plural us to deal with these with this gap and to explore other forms of this assembly making, no? With this plurality of knowledge, and which are not necessarily disciplinary, but are far beyond the disciplinary.
Almost as a closing point, or just because we want to leave some time to open the microphone, but I would like to put on the table a last question that is related with this heroic and almost mythological narrative of what architecture is. It is said that the action of drawing a line or materializing a wall or whatever on the territory is one of the first architectural gestures that we can do. A boundary and limit between an exterior and an interior. And in that sense, there is an interesting story, an interesting narrative that omits a very important part. That is the violence implicit on these gestures, no? Towards the territory, towards the already existing matter, organic and inorganic matter over there, and also to its inhabitants, no? And also, in this interesting story, there is an immediate exclusion decided by the institution, the power, or the one that had the privilege to draw this line. If violence and exclusions that we have seen here, no, as the gentrification that displays these centenary gardens, the pine forest, no, that this idea of destructive pine forest that displays, or the very explicit case of the migrants and refugees or the city plaza. If all these exclusions and violence have been a constant in architectural productions, and in our way of understanding and producing the space and the territory, it is even possible to work or to find spatial practices that do not reproduce this displacement or externalize this violence to other agents. It is possible to work without this explicit violence that architectural production have, or it is an inherent consequences of all spatial productions. It is possible to work without all of this.
So I think that every spatial practice is inherently violent in that it creates an order, as we said. So, and that order, like, inevitably creates inclusions and exclusions. I'm thinking of the image of the line, or the metaphor of the line, which is the paradigmatic or the iconic way in which we represent architecture, or the architectural discipline, which, thinking of the line, we think of very abstract systems where the order is very clear, right? And I'm thinking maybe that we might think instead another metaphor, the metaphor of the fabric, to think of our discipline. The fabric can have like different layers, can have different like sort of compositions. So it might talk more about the complexity of our practice. So it's not an abstract order, but actually it encompasses like many other relations. So it's not just the material world, but like relations, social relations, relations with non-humans. So this is just like as a suggestion in the way we look at our practice. But then maybe more specific, I think, what you, Diego, and Camilo suggested before, this idea of thinking of architecture as a more like ecosystemic, or in like through ecosystems, right? Or that I could say more of as an infrastructure, right? Which would entail seeing our discipline, our practice as more encompassing, more open, always in the making, this idea of always posing questions, always evolving and unfolding, more than human, so not just related to people. A practice that doesn't finish within the limits of the building, or one like the building or the product or whatever architecture we've commissioned to do finish, but actually life goes on beyond that opening moment. And also makes us think of our discipline as a collaborative practice. If it is infrastructural, if it relates, engages, networks, webs, inevitably we need to do this in collaboration with other agents, with other disciplines, and so. And I think, again, going back to this idea of the infrastructure, I really like the definition by Abdulhamid Simon, and that says that infrastructures are like socio-material networks that encompasses like different kinds of relations to sustain the everyday life. And in doing so, like all the agents that are involved enact political imaginations. They might reproduce existing ones, or actually they have the potential to create and invent new ones. And I think that's also like a very interesting insight in what we can transform or how our discipline might look like. It also relates to the definition by Tronto of care, when she mentions these life-sustaining webs, again, this idea of the assemblage. And like, again, thinking of it as an infrastructural practice might help us or to ask the question of in every project that we undertake, for every architecture, what type of care assemblages does this architecture facilitate or hinder? So again, going back to this idea of care, like centering care as the new paradigm of our discipline, I think this infrastructural or like ecosystemic thinking for our practice might have some potential for this idea.
Thank you for the question. You know, in the context in which we are, which is this, you know, in the Venice Architecture Biennial, and after the experience of visiting all of the propositions made by pavilions, but also the different people who participated in the biennial, I mean, it's impossible not to also make a reflection about language and accessibility of the very way in which our discipline talks to others, if it does so. So I think if there is this desire of which was present in your question, I think perhaps we could start by thinking about language and where exactly, you know, if we thought physiologically in the context of the discipline, where would this language operate? And I'm just reminded of a philosopher I like very much, which is Michael Marder, who writes about the life of plants and what could we learn, right, if we became more vegetable. And one of the things he says is that, and he studies Western philosophy and how Western philosophy has treated plants as part of his investigation. And one of the proposals he makes is that if we learned with the plants, we would invert many of the structural ideas that are like fundaments of our, let's say, Western understanding of reality. One of them is to become more superficial rather than deep. We tend to associate deepness with that which is not accessible and that which is therefore valuable and meaningful. But if we learn from plants, we will see that, for example, the way in which plants, the intelligence of plants is often in the leaves, where photosynthesis happens. To be superficial is to think of architecture, you know, in the context of architecture would be, first of all, to question the fossil fuel and the architecture's use of energy through processes of fracking and drilling and going deep. But I think also through, and so to embrace a much more symbiotic relationship with place, with the immediate place, like kind of this radical situatedness, right? And I believe it's important to think about this as a role for architecture, let's say physiologically, but also in terms of discourse, in terms of, I mean, if the subject of today is carrying assemblies, I think it's important to also learn from these ecosystemic examples and think, how can we be more superficial in the sense that we are at the surface, as in the space of contact with those with which we are talking, and in an equal, how is that position sort of made a little bit more equal? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, about this issue of violence, as you said, is there, is always somehow there, but I think in our practice we try to be more and increasingly conscious, I think, about the violences that the work we do unfolds, and to, in certain way, minimize or how we can deal with that and create other dynamics, being aware that is gonna be somehow there. But on the other hand, it's not only for us about also how to minimize, but also how to open up through the projects other possibilities. And for example, in this project of this house, we have been living in the last year in the mountains, which I'm very happy. I never lived in the, so I was very urban, and it's extremely a special experience. But it was this question of how to make the house with the smallest house in terms of square meters, but a very broad house, and house that could open the possibilities of home and expand the possibilities of home. So I think that was this question of how to contract in some way in the use of matter, for example, or the use of spatial pine with responsible forest from Soria, which was 300 kilometers from the site, and different kind of strategies to don't use heating system or cooling system, etc. But at the same time, how to create a more plural us, for example, with our neighbors, which were not only Virginia, Raúl, and other neighbors that we have learned so much, but also the bats, which are so fundamental also from an anthropocentric and egoistic point of view, are so important for our survival, or the importance also to recognize other neighbors which are kind of abject bodies in this forest, like this processionary moth, which even ecologists don't want even to hear about it because of ecological balance and so much. But in this case, for example, anti-species thinking was very challenging, and so I think there are possibilities also to create other kind of assemblages in architecture, where also the social issues, like in this case gender, other issues, can come together with environmental issues. And I think we're very much interested in these interwoven relations of struggles, no? And not think of them as separated, but very much intertwined.
Thank you very much. We had like a last question, a very naive question as an exit point, that was, how can we imagine this kind of empathic and critical spatial practices? But I think that the whole debate was completely full of different notions, of different keywords that we can imagine, or we can see some glimpses of these possible new spaces to come. No? That was a very important thing to us to reflect on this discussion. So I think that we don't have to have this final question, because all the debate was giving the answers or giving some clues, no, to think this possible space to come, more empathetic, more reclaiming joy, attending to life, healing practices, reparations, interdependence, and so on. We have a full debate full of these things. So I only want to thank you for this discussion, for this generosity of bringing to the table all these urgencies and all these topics that is important to discuss and is important to reflect, to open up the space of discussion, no? To open up these frameworks limited by discipline, limited by the frameworks of work or curatorial events and so on. And I think it's really important to open up that space. So thank you very much. As participants in this debate, thank you very much to the organizers to let us talk about these things with totally freedom, and to talk about this and to rethink how democracy and spatial practices can be intertwined. No? So thank you very much to all the discussion. I think we don't have time to pass the mic to the audience, but if some of you have a really urgent question, or do you want to talk and not to be included in the discussion, please let us know. But thank you very much to all of you for that.